Wow, what an introduction. First of all, I would like to thank the ISCHE Executive Committee and also everyone in this room for asking me to give a keynote. I much appreciate your faith in me giving you an interesting conversation today. Anyway, the best of times and the worst of times, adventures in education revisited. Three elements constitute the subject in the title of this lecture. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. So begins the opening paragraph of Charles Dickens' book, A Tale of Two Cities, which was published in 31 weekly parts from the 30th of April to the 26th of November, 1859. It continues. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. There have been times when, as the British historian Brian Simon wrote, when everything in the world of education seems to be advancing tumultuously, when the whole field seems animated by a positive spirit, when all seems to be working to the same end. But, he then writes, periods of advance are often followed by a reaction against all that has been achieved, and advances can be reversed and result in a move, more or less rapid, he continues, towards forms of control, towards overall constraint, the imposition of new divisions, a reversion to once rejected practices within systems, within schools and colleges, accompanied by ideological transformations necessary once again to legitimize discarded approaches and practices. Brian Simon was writing about the English experience in the 1880s and 90s and the 1960s and 1980s. But equally, I believe, we can all identify other experiences where education democracies have and are under assault. And that's the framing agenda of the talk I wish to give. Why adventures in education? I need to give you some biographical details to answer that question. After undergraduate study and postgraduate research, the latter focused on the English Reformation, I trained as a secondary school teacher, history teacher, in the School of Education at the University of Birmingham. After 14 years, first as a classroom teacher and later the head of a multicultural teaching unit, I became what's known as a teacher educator in a small higher education college in Birmingham in 1991. It was there I met for the first time Martin Lawn, Professor Martin Lawn, and he was appointed as my mentor to guide me through what it was to be a tutor for teachers in the Birmingham University. And he recommended to me, while I was being inducted, that I should read William van der Eycken and Barry Turner's book, Adventures in Education, which was published in 1969. Their book, as they described it, was, and I quote, an exercise in the archaeology of education, an attempt to explore in various experiments started by educational pioneers and to examine how far and why they succeeded or failed. They sought out the recollections of those who actually took part in these adventures, digging up half-submerged incidents, voices already retired from active life, torn newspapers, faded broadsheets, dusty trunks in attics, and with each documented experiment, they sourced photographic evidence. So we can see here, top left-hand corner, that is Susan Isaacs, a very important educational psychologist in Malting School. Below that, that's the Burston Strike School, when students and teachers went on strike. And also, on the right-hand side, creativity happening in a classroom, while some children are doing grammar work, other children were painting on the walls. As an historian, I was increasingly attracted to this new combination of archaeology of education, educational experiments, and the visual. The more so, as I'd long been fascinated by Abby Warburg's experimental working practice of constructing a visual argument by arranging photographs to create display panels for lectures. So the visual was very, very important to me in a sense of how I wanted to be an historian of education. Over time, this combination of archaeology, experiments, and the visual in the history of education shaped my historical practice, and in particular made me more intellectually inquisitive. And later, I became a follower of W.G. Sable's idea of ruminant curiosity, as is best described by the historian Patrick Joyce. A striving to find the connections leading from one thing, a real thing, to others. Not looking for what we know already before we begin, but recognizing conjunctions as they arise. Glimpsing many paths as we walk down only a few. Seeing in snatches the strangeness of the world. In the process, it became clear that new inventions in education could immeasurably enrich contemporary educational research by attending to the historical dimension and being open to insights and practices from other disciplines. So why Adventures in Education revisited, and why now? In May 1924, I was invited alongside my Birmingham colleague, Dr. Sean Roberts, to contribute to a special issue of the journal Educatio e Historia on the theme of public presence and social commitment of the history of education, past, present, and future. Our contribution focused on the Domus Research Centre in Histories of Education from its foundation in Birmingham in 2001 and to the present day, documenting historical practices and reflecting upon ways of knowing the associated research connections, the relationships and networks, and the products of research. In short, for this journal, an historical narrative was generated. But in the process of piecing the narrative together, I found myself not only revisiting research projects, but also remembering conversations shared, connections made, and collaborations executed. A historian, as Patrick Joyce has put it, I quote, no longer simply a mirror to the past, but now himself actively a site of memory. Indeed, I feel like I'm an institution rather than being a single academic. In part, the why and the now was simply the product of engagement with my past. But then a series of events that followed. First, in the autumn of 2024, a conference call notice was circulated in a unique collaboration between History Lab Plus, History Lab, and History UK, with the title of Teaching in a Time of Crisis. The call notice read as follows. As we begin another academic year, history feels more fragile and more essential than ever before. In a world of global pandemics, political unrest, environmental collapse, the cost of living crisis, and the financial devastation of higher education, educators and students are navigating a shared sense of precarity. We are tasked with understanding a relentlessly changing present through the lens of the past, all the while remaining uncertain about our economic, institutional, and personal futures. It continued, how do we equip students, to connect the dots between history and climate collapse? How do we work? How do we talk about historical justice and inequality in ways that strengthen ongoing struggles for justice? These questions are about how we teach history when the world feels like it's falling apart, and how we prepare our students to navigate all this chaos. The organisers accepted that as educators they had to adapt methods, rethink pedagogies, and explore innovative ways to engage while addressing the complexities of the present moment. Then in March 2025, the US President issued an executive order entitled Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History, which claimed that there had been a concerted and widespread effort to rewrite our nation's history, replacing objective facts with a distorted narrative driven by ideology rather than truth. A week later, the Council of Europe issued in its third annual Forum for History of Education its report, and it said, increasingly, a right-wing version of the past is becoming weaponized and programmed and funded in all kinds of different spaces. And we are seeing our national spaces and our national histories being taken over with purpose and well-funded process. In April, the Trump administration threatened universities with funding cuts unless there was greater government control over research and teaching. 60 universities were put on notice that they would be investigated for alleged campus anti-Semitism. And as Ryan Enos, a political scientist and professor of government at Harvard, commented, it was, quote, an authoritarian attack on higher education. Just something for you to absorb about American politics at the present. I wasn't sure about showing this one, but I'm sure you get the message. In April and May, 6,700 people aged between the ages of 16 and 26 in Britain, Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Greece and Poland all responded to the 9th annual survey by YouGov for the Dewey Foundation. And of them, I quote, 48% were worried that the democratic system in their own country is endangered. Thorsten Fass of Berlin's Free University, who worked on the study, said, among people who see themselves as politically to the right of and feel economically disadvantaged, their support of democracy sinks to just 1 in 3. Democracy is under pressure from within and without. In short, these events pointed collectively to an accumulation of evidence that we are entering the worst of times. Indeed, signs began to slowly build up following the global financial crash of 2008. There were growing anxieties about cultural collapse, the adoption of alarmist rhetoric, claims that freedom and democracy were incompatible, that democracy should be dismantled, that authority was faltering across the world, and society was falling back to autocracy. In addition, far-right agendas infiltrated education across Europe, Asia, and Latin America, with schools and universities becoming arenas for culture wars, far-right approaches to change curriculum content and school structure, and the promotion of neoliberal agendas and authoritarian principles. In the United Kingdom, concerns were raised about the toxic behaviour of boys in school, which, according to the Secretary of State for Education, Bridget Phillipson, was, I quote, a defining issue of our time, with toxic online influences on the rise, including misogyny. What was needed, she argued, was curiosity, compassion, kindness, resilience, hope, and respect. And the answer, according to Phillipson, was that boys needed strong, positive male role models to look up to, at home and at school. The problem, she reported, though, was that only 1 in 4 of the teachers in our schools are men. And the 28,000 new teachers recruited since 2010, just 533 of those are men. There was also growing online radicalisation and the recruitment of young boys into far-right groups, and they're being infected with hatred and lies. Girls were also under pressure. International research found that in the UK, Finland, Ireland and Sweden, girls in the first stages of secondary education were exhibiting a decline in emotional engagement, increased disenchantment with education, and feeling less safe at school compared with the years before the COVID pandemic. Like boys, girls were also finding normal challenges of growing up totally distorted by the pressures of social media and the rise of influencers. Given all the above, we might do well to recall Walter Benjamin's Angel of History. With his face turned towards the past, as a storm is blowing from paradise, and where a chain of events appears before us, he sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage, and hurls it at his feet. And the storm drives him irresistibly into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows towards the sky. We are moving irresistibly into the worst of times. But we have been here before, and it is important as historians of education that we take responsibility for documenting earlier crises that have impacted on education, and that we converse with the ghosts of our pasts to understand where we are and what our futures might be. The worst of times. Briefly, back in 1979, at the end of one school Monday, I was on duty marshalling 11 to 18-year-old children onto school buses and away from the school grounds, when I became aware of a male figure to my left who was giving out leaflets to children. As I approached, he quickly ran away, but he dropped a leaflet, which I picked up. It was A5 in size, quite small, so easy to slip in your pocket, and was professionally printed on both sides. I'm going to show you this now. I've never ever shown this to anybody else in terms of the research I write about, because I'm not sure whether I feel comfortable showing what you're going to see. What you got here, I've turned the A5 into one piece. On the front was a crude anti-Semitic cartoon of a teacher, bearded and badge-wearing, next to a blackboard covered in slogans: "Down with Britain," "Get rid of the Queen," "Black is best," "Troops out." And next to the cartoon, in large, bold capital letters, were the words, "How to spot a red teacher." Immediately below was a statement about commies. They call themselves Marxists, even socialists. They've infiltrated our schools. They sneer at our British race and nation and everything that's made Britain great. Don't let them get away with it. Be proud to be British. Then, using the call and refrain model, the leaflet presented the many tricks that the commie teachers use to bend children's minds and the way to answer back. I'm going to share with you a few extracts. The racial equality lie. Commie teachers will tell you that all races are equal. They will tell you that intelligence is not inborn, but is produced by a good environment. They will tell you that if all races were brought up in the same environment, they would all be equal. Tell the red teacher that top scientists like Jensen and ISCHE say this is rubbish. Scientists say that races are born different in all sorts of ways, especially intelligence. This is because we inherit our abilities genetically. Multiracialist propaganda. Commies want to wreck Britain. That is why they promote multiracialism. They will tell you we've always had immigrants and that British people are already a mixture of different races. Tell the red teacher that this is untrue and that the Saxons, the Celts, the Danes, the Normans, etc., who formed the British people were all groups of the same race, the white North European. Negroes and Asians are different races. Other commentaries included the Rate Hastings smear, lies about British history, attacks on patriotism. More worrying to me as a teacher was how the leaflet ended with another statement. Young National Front is the youth organisation of Britain's fastest growing political party, the National Front. And patriotic young Britons are joining us by the thousand. And at the bottom of the page, there's a blank membership form. Name, age, date of birth, address for those who are under the age of 14. Sorry, of the age of 14. For me, as a teacher in a school in Wolverhampton near Birmingham, it was a moment that exposed how racist ideas were being directed at both school teachers and school children. And for me, a critical turning point in my own educational journey. The 1980s was a decade in which racism flourished in Britain and other European countries. Writing about Britain, the author Salman Rushdie described the nation as two entirely different worlds, and the one you inherited was determined by the colour of your skin. Black and Asian settlers in Britain had, as Rushdie continued, only one real problem. The problem is white people. Racism, of course, is not our problem, it is yours. We simply suffer the effects of your problem. In other words, like the decade before, it proved to be one of the worst of times, with Rushdie describing in detail how if you were black or Asian, you'd be living in the worst available public housing. You'd be suffering from a far higher unemployment rate than white neighbours. You'd be faced with street armies of neo-fascists. You would be fearful of the police, harassed at immigration points, and when they protested, were told there was no reason for them to stay if they didn't like it, even though they had British citizenship. Oops. This is Tam Joseph is a very talented black British artist, and this piece was done in 1983, and it's called UK School Report. He's good at sports, he likes music, but he's got dreads. He needs surveillance. He kind of captures the way in which the representation of black youngsters in the UK were being captured. Okay. That said, it was also a decade in which multiculturalism did flourish in inner city schools. But the education reforms of the Conservative government paid no heed whatsoever to cultural diversity and disregarded the likely consequences for ethnic minority pupils, parents and communities. Colour blindness was the sanctioned approach. Well, that's all been pretty glum so far, hasn't it? So I want to talk now about the best of times. What then are the best of times? In the early 1990s, Harold Silver, who was known for his curiosity and a commitment to social justice, pointed to a lacuna in the history of education research when he wrote, and I quote, "It is difficult to believe that historians have made almost no attempt to reconstruct the classroom, the culture of the classroom, the social relations of the classroom, and that in contrast to educational context and curriculum history, they were just silences. It proved to be a call for a paradigm shift towards a greater focus on teachers and children's experiences of past schooling. And in the words of the American historian of education, David Tyack, I quote, of examining the past in shaping wise decisions about the future of education. Two small international conferences followed in 1995 and 1996 under the banner Silences and Images, the Social History of the Classroom. And both of these conferences directly addressed Silver's classroom agenda. A book under the same title was published in 1999, and a second multi-authored book led by Mark de Pape, Order in Progress, Everyday Education Practice, Belgium 1880 to 1970, followed, and together with the conferences, they produced new adventures in education, adventures that focused on a determination to produce new work in new ways and reported in new forms, and helped to foster the emergence of the best of times in the late 1990s into the first decade of the 21st century. This was also a period that benefited from the emergence of a supranational European educational space, which attracted transnational lines of inquiry and history of education projects. And in 1999 saw the first meeting of the History of Education Network of the European Educational Research Association, ERA, which was convened by academics from Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, and the UK. New work and new ways of working flourished as historians of education focused on space and place, the body and the sensual, the visual and the material, sought intellectual exchange with others outside the discipline of history of education, pursued interdisciplinary crossings, and seized opportunities to link interests with current challenges and contemporary concerns. These outcomes can be found in our journals and our conferences of our learned societies, but so can our many associated new adventures in education. And what follows now is an account of one such adventure of the archaeological, the experimental, and the visual in history of education. Its title is Active Conversations with the Past. Active conversations with the past have been a recurring theme in the work of the educationalist Michael Fielding. In Putting Hands Around the Flame, Reclaiming the Radical Tradition in State Education in 2005, he observed that, I quote, our capacity to interrogate the present with any degree of wisdom or any likelihood of creating a more fulfilling future rests significantly on our knowledge and engagement with the past, and with the establishment of continuities that contemporary culture denies. Fielding returned to his theme in his co-authored book, Radical Education and the Common School, where he advocated the production of micro-histories of schools to progress social alternatives in education. These micro-histories would be, as he termed them, critical case studies of possibilities. In 2014, Fielding again returned to his theme when he called for historians of education to go beyond the necessity of counter-history, instead to capture the radical and the adventurous, and to find our genealogies, not merely inherit them. To do so, he concluded, we must be active, not merely receptive in our conversations with the past. For Fielding, the end result of such work would be to present, to use John Berger's phrase, the honour of an alternative. Fielding's passion for active conversations with the past translated into multiple actions by many historians of education. First, a symposium was organised under the title Adventures in Cultural Education at the 37th International Standing Conference for the History of Education, in other words, ISCHE, at Istanbul University in 2015. and it's attracted historians of education from Belgium, Germany, Hungary, Japan, Latvia, Luxembourg, Spain, and the United Kingdom, all wanting to participate in this agenda about adventures in cultural education. The aim of the symposium, following van der Eycken and Turner's model, was to undertake, and I quote, exercise in the archaeology of cultural learning through a trans-European dialogue which would explore experiments in learning which had engagement with culture at the heart of children's learning experiences and examine how far and why they succeeded or failed. Second, further ideas about the sites, practices and associated technologies of cultural learning were explored through a series of experimental workshops funded by ERA under the title Cultural Learning, Identity and the European Project, and organised jointly by ERA's Network 17, History of Education, and Network 20, Research in Innovative Intercultural Environments. The workshops took place in Barcelona in 2015 and Riga in 2016. Third, workshop findings from these gatherings were presented at the ERA in Dublin in 2016. Fourth, a special issue of Pedagogica Historica, Adventures in Cultural Learning, was published in 2017. All these research activities explored dimensions of cultural learning through a series of adventures or case studies, drawn from a broad range of national, educational and political contexts. In 2019, a fifth activity on the problem of genealogy and finding evidence, particularly when the focus was shifted from pioneers of radical education and their associated sites of learning to the anonymous practitioners and their everyday work as teachers. In other words, it was a problem. The problem is, how do we find the radical teachers who we do not have much documentation for? How do we find people who are trying to make change in the way in which we understand the past, and can change the future? And this brings me to the case of one teacher, Amy Waite. So, formal documentary evidence of Amy Waite as a progressive teacher is limited. Birmingham Education Authority employed teacher record cards, and Amy's card details her career. She was born in 1889 and trained as a teacher for 2 years in Tottenham College, London. She arrived in Birmingham in 1914 and taught in 2 schools before arriving as headmistress of Floodgate Street School in Birmingham in 1923. She left that school in 1931 to become headmistress of Tinkers Farm Junior Infant School just outside the city centre boundary. It was statutory for all schools in England to keep school logbooks, which detailed daily happenings in a school. The logbook for Floodgate Street is available for the period 1891 to 1920, but sadly not for 1923 to 31, when she was headmistress, so I couldn't find much about what she was doing in that role. The only evidence, so the logbooks for Tinkers Farm are also not available. They're not in the city archives. So the only evidence we have really of Miss Waite and the 2 schools where she was headmistress are 2 photographic albums. The social biographies of these albums are very similar. They were carefully constructed by Miss Waite in each of her schools. Images were selected, sequenced, placed on the page, and captions written alongside. They were carefully stored either at a home or in the school, and in time they've now been deposited as artefacts in the city archive, where they've been accessioned and catalogued. Looking at the albums alongside each other, there's a similarity in their content and form. Both albums are largely made up of non-professional snapshots, and both are external images. So, one of the earliest sequences of photographs in the Floodgate album is of children in a country field on the edge of the city. Children are photographed holding wildflowers. Urban children engaging with nature, because there were no wildflowers in the centre of the city. Floodgate Street School was located in the heart of what was regarded as the worst slum area in Birmingham. Coincidentally, the very field they were in is the same place where later the Tinkers Farm School would be built a decade later. It's an interesting connection there with the images. The album also contains 2 outdoor sequences, but this time in the school playground. One is of children in groups and alone, holding plants, and the caption reads, "Beans we've grown ourselves." This is nature in the industrial city. The second is of children dressing up and engaging in a drama about Red Riding Hood. Cooperative activities feature heavily in the Tinkers Farm album, with images of drama, performance, music and dance. Girls here are captured participating in expressive movement, liberating the body from self-conscious inhibition. Cooperation is not limited to the formal curriculum. There's a newspaper photographic clipping from the 1930s of refugee Basque children, and the caption reads, "We also visited them with a carload of clothing." In another photograph, there's a Czech refugee, Mr. Baranji, who is standing next to a senior teacher, Mr. Stone. Another photograph is of a cheque for, I missed that one, sorry. Another photograph is, that one there, is a cheque for £100 being presented for the Prisoner of War Fund, all money raised by teachers and children in the school. A fifth photograph is of a small group of children with the caption, 1948, we sent clothing to a German school in Cologne. The 2 albums present a visual record of a teacher's life. The images in the album convey certain meanings and perform certain actions, and in doing so, construct a particular narrative of schooling and associated pedagogical practice. We can see progressive education in action. It is also clear from the albums that a particular view of the child was held and promoted. The child is an active agent in their own learning, and with the teacher in the role of facilitator in this process. In short, the use of vernacular photographs provides evidentiary basis to add Amy Waite to Fielding's genealogy of the progressive and the adventurous. I cannot leave this story without going back to the teacher photograph standing next to the Czech refugee. The man on the right, on the left-hand photograph on the right, is A.L. Stone, who was later head teacher of Stewart Street School in Birmingham and was famous as the author of Story of a School, and for introducing progressive teaching methods that put music, movement, art and drama at the centre of the curriculum. Everything was taught through those 4 areas: music, movement, art and drama. And that school attracted visitors from across the UK and across Europe. But that is another story. So I'm coming to some closure. There's a very famous statement by John Dewey, which I've heard 3 times, I think, in this week alone, in this conference. Democracy needs to be reborn anew every generation, and education is its midwife. So wrote John Dewey in 1917. But something additional can come. Writing 2 decades later, he argued that practicing democracy could be accomplished only by inventive effort and creative activity. In 2021, UNESCO published Reimagining Our Futures Together, a research report and policy document that made the case, following Dewey, for a new social contract for education. The context, as reported in the UNESCO report, was of increasing uncertainty in the world. fears about climate change and pathogen mutations, the fraying of democracy and civil society, populism and identity politics, and the shift to authoritarianism. The report was very positive about the key role of universities in the futures of education, and again, following Dewey, the importance of the creative and the innovative, and the commitment to education as a common goal, alongside being a partner with other educational institutions and engaging with communities both local and global. John Berger, in his book The Shape of a Pocket, wrote that, I quote, "There are historical periods when madness appears to be what it is, a rare and abnormal affliction. There are other periods, like the one we have just entered, when madness appears to be typical." Berger was speaking truth to power. We are witnessing that discord, instability and social polarisation have continued to flourish, and the norms of democracy are being slowly dismantled and the rights of citizens incrementally eroded. Problems will no doubt intensify because of the overwhelming interconnectivity of the world's various crises, as documented by the American historian Adam Tooze, with his series of crisis pictures that, I quote, "help us to see that not only do we face multiple macroscopic risks, hedged with great uncertainty, but their interactions tend to be escalatory." We are seeing history move, as Stuart Hall wrote, from one conjuncture to another, to a period where different social, political, economic, and ideological contradictions that are always at play in the historical moment are being condensed as crises mount. Bruno Latour and Nikolai Schultz have cautioned that while there are times when it's tempting to give in to despair, it is nevertheless necessary to explore, refine, amplify, and popularise the passions necessary to address crises. A passion, for example, that Ischion Hutchinson, Professor of Humanities at Cornell University, translated into being much more vigilant in his teaching, and by encouraging amongst his students fearless learning as a way of outlasting the present moment. This slide here is from the No Kings rally in New York, all to do with the possibility of a new monarchy in the US. And it says, "History has its eyes on us." For us, as historians of education, we need to continue seeking out active conversations with the past, practicing democracy to reveal the truth, to reveal true over the false, disturbing common ways of thinking as we seek out points of friction between past and present, linking our interests with current challenges and pointing to gaps in current practice. As T.J. Demas says, being stronger together than apart, seeing the presence of possibility in these grim and troubled times, and continuing to develop the capacity to imagine new adventures in education. I will leave you with two final remarks. 2025 marks the 100th anniversary of F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel, The Great Gatsby. In that novel, Tom Buchanan tells his wife Daisy the following, and I quote, "Civilization's going to pieces. If we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's been proved." This is a position held by current believers in the Great Replacement theory. The fact that a century of such predictions of racial apocalypse have still not come true goes to show that the tendency of the privileged to believe themselves under mortal threat is always with us. And one final reminder, I quote, "The press is the enemy. The establishment is the enemy. Professors are the enemy. Write that on the blackboard 100 times and never forget it." That was the great President Richard Nixon in conversation with Henry Kissinger, 14th of December 1972, discussing Vietnam. Thank you for your attention.